Ruth. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, team.
Hi.
Morning.
Morning, morning. It's a bit different doing these things in the morning.
Yeah.
Let me check my video as well.
Hi,
Hi, Nasida.
Nasida.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, Julie.
How is everybody?
Doing
Fine,
good.
thank you.
Yeah.
Ready for the final push?
So let me just be clear. On your screen, are you able to see us together?
I see all of you on the top. Yeah.
Or just on the top?
Yes.
So you're not able to see the format?
But if I click the gallery view option,
you can see that.
Pardon?
When you click the gallery view option, you see the 4 of us on the screen.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if it's possible to do that.
Where do I find the gallery option? Sorry.
Just in the top right-hand corner.
Ah, view?
View or gallery view?
Yes.
Yeah, I see you on there.
No, I just wanted to know if there's a way to make this possible for everyone to spotlight a screen this week. I don't know if anyone has seen that feature.
To do what, sorry?
Okay, I was thinking maybe in the breakout rooms when we'll be doing the discussion. So I wanted to make it in such a moderator may be able to the spotlight for everyone to be able to see. Like if you, Ruth, have you pressed the gallery view?
Yeah.
Yes, so you can see the 4 speakers right now.
Yes.
So is there a way to do that, let's say during the breakout room? Yeah, so that a screen like that is visible to everyone.
Yeah, maybe,
yes. Just especially during the introduction session. Yeah, where in the breakout rooms where we'll be having the introductions, I thought maybe we can do that. So yeah, at the same time too. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense, but I just think the view is personal to each person's computer now. Okay. So you're saying I don't think you can control other people's view from the master control.
Okay.
But, what we could do is we can encourage people to use the gallery view option when we introduce the task, and then that will allow people to see everybody in case they're not aware of it. Is that what you mean? It's a good idea. Good idea, yes. Yeah.
My name is Bianca Gishangi. I'm the coordinator for the Eastern Africa Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance, and will also be co-moderated by Tim Kalman, who's the director for Carbon Africa. And just as a reminder, today's session will take a slightly different format from the other two. So we'll only have one presentation and one panel, and then we'll go into peer-to-peer exchange using breakout rooms. Thank you, Tim. Oh, and so just a brief overview on what we've been covering during the week. So session 1 started with carbon market engagement and CDM transition. As you may recall, we did an in-depth recap in the last session with a lot of distinguished speakers from the UNFCCC and the UK government giving us an outline on where we are currently on carbon market activities from the perspective of the negotiations. And then we went into detail on what CDM transition would entail and what's at stake for Eastern African developers. Then the last session, we looked at the key features of the Paris Agreement and the NDCs, and we'll go into a recap of that just after this. And then today's session is going to be looking at piloting activities under Article 6. And this is now to take us to what's actually happening on the ground and what we're learning for the upcoming, or actually the incoming guidance and rules on the cooperative approaches and new mechanism for Article 6. Thank you, Tim. I think we'll do the recap now. Great. So just to take us through what we did in the last session, which had quite engaging presentations with a lot of information to condense in 2 hours. We covered quite a bit on NDCs and corresponding adjustments. So we had presentations from the UNFCCC, and they highlighted the key features of NDCs. And NDCs tend to be quite flexible in their design, but the host countries do have a similar mandatory task in preparing them and in communicating them at the COPs. Communicating them on an international level. And these mandatory processes include the submission of the NDCs and enhancement ambition cycle. So those are key dates to remember, that the current NDC updates are to be submitted by 2020 with renewals every 5 years. However, the NDCs are built on what we know as progression, in the sense that the submitted NDCs tend to be new and have to be better than the last one that was submitted. This goes hand in hand with ambition, in the sense that you have to keep improving the mitigation actions and adaptation actions that you submit in your NDC, so that in the long term, there is significant real impact in the climate activities that we're doing to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement. So tracking of the NDCs is going to be done through a lot of reporting, and we're going to have what are known as the biennial transparency reports. This will be happening every 2 years, and after every 5 years, we'll be having what is known as a global stocktake, where parties come together and review the progress on implementing their NDCs. And this is important to markets, because markets under the use of Article 6 are part of the NDC, and governments need to understand how this relates to the BTRs. And then after this session, we went further into understanding the concept of corresponding adjustments, because, and it started off, we didn't have that much time to go into a lot of detail, but Stefan really explained how double counting can happen in many different forms. You can have double issuance, you can have double claiming, and double use. So this is, for example, when you have one unit being used towards multiple NDCs, or one unit being used in an NDC and being used in a different system like Corsia. But in order to avoid the double counting, the parties agreed to do what are known as corresponding adjustments upon these ITMO transfers with the tracking and the reporting. One thing he highlighted, at least for the host countries, which a lot of Eastern African countries will be, is that they do have a certain amount of emission reductions that they can internationally transfer without jeopardizing achieving their targets. So they need to be really careful and need to know how to do their corresponding adjustments very clearly, so as to avoid that risk of not hitting the target. And this whole discussion also brings in what project eligibility will look like. And under the CDM, we had additionality, but now we have this whole concept of NDCs, and what is it going to look like now with the NDCs coming on board. And then also the concept of having projects under the conditional or the unconditional part of the NDCs, whereby it might be more difficult to justify a carbon project in the unconditional part due to the government using their own resources for that. So there's a lot of discussion around project eligibility. We'll be seeing a lot more discussion and concepts that have been there before being revisited or being revised. So that's something that definitely will be undergoing. And then there's a lot of infrastructure and institutional frameworks that are required by Eastern African countries, such as robust inventories and registries and procedures, so that they can actually implement proper tracking of the ITMO flows. But it's also important because of bilateral agreements. Countries want to trust each other that they can actually be transparent on both counts. So systems are required on all sides, and reporting is required on all sides. So just lastly, I'll say that point that Stefan mentioned was that incentive structures will change, in the sense that countries will not want to be selling their cheap emission reductions. So it's really key to incentivize the sectors that will give them high-priced emission reductions. But with that, I will hand over to Tim, who'll take us through the rest of the recap for day 2. Yeah.
Thanks, Bianca. So yeah, from my side, it was we shifted across to the voluntary carbon markets in the afternoon. sorry, in the second half of the session on Wednesday. And I mean, for me personally, it was a really rich body of information. In terms of the panelists that spoke, there was two of the main voluntary standards, the voluntary carbon standards who presented, Vera and Gold Standard, and then a couple of project developer voices as well from the PD Forum, which represents quite a few developers and is a well-established voice, and Climate Care as a specific company as well. And yeah, there was a lot of information coming through, a lot of it kind of positive, but some concerns around the lack of clarity currently on the transition and moving forwards. So I've crudely packaged it into three main points that came through from what I understood, but clearly there's a lot more to be unpacked from the details from those discussions. But I packaged it in three things. So one was on scale, the second point was around labeling, and the third point was on the kind of regulatory space. So firstly, with regards to scale, I think Patrick, particularly from Climate Care, reminded us of the kind of underlying climate change issues and the speed at which we need to implement mitigation actions. And based on that kind of growing understanding globally, we hope, they themselves have reported seeing a significantly increased demand from corporates, from the private sector who engage with them over the last 18 to 24 months, and see that increasing as we move forwards as well. So it's positive in that sense. And the standards as well also express that there's quite a bit of interest in their services as well. So that was positive. And I think that manifested itself quite nicely in the announcement around the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, which we've shared a link in this PowerPoint, which is pretty accessible though, but if you simply throw it into Google, it will come up. But Mark Carney in his last couple of months at the Bank of England chose the voluntary carbon market around kind of quite significant funding opportunities under a pilot in 2021 already. So certainly one to very much watch there as well. Secondly was on labeling. So there's a real differentiation from both the standards, but also from the private sector developers on the utilization of the credits or the units that are being generated, and how that might result in a differentiation of labeling or differentiation of usage. So some examples: is it purely for the domestic market and therefore corresponding adjustments might not be required? Is it for an ITMO transfer and therefore some Article 6 labeling might be required? And then also there was discussions around the corresponding adjustment being an attribute and not necessarily a transfer taking place as well, for those for kind of voluntary contributing to a country's NDC. I say all of this paraphrasing and bringing up the topics that were discussed, so I'm going to go around clearly develop as we move forward, likely under the UNFCCC processes as well. So that was the second point on labeling. And then thirdly, around regulations. So I think we're definitely living through a period of transition. This concerns raised back at the, not voluntarily, sorry, but at the CDM level, and this potential gap, not to preempt anything from the executive board meeting and other discussions under the UNFCCC, but some real concerns about between the back end of 2020 and the COP in November 2021. So yeah, they will see yeah, some interesting submissions as well to that meeting as it's ongoing. And then that lack of certainty, I think there was particularly Naomi from Vera mentioned that it's taken quite a long time for corporates to get on board with the climate change issue. And it seems that that kind of groundswell is beginning to come up. And yeah, real hope that the regulatory uncertainties don't then turn people away from this door, understanding that yeah, environmental integrity is paramount, but hoping that those two things can be balanced. So yeah, people coming to get involved, but having the regulatory certainty to also get involved. So I think from my side, Bianca, that's it as a summary.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I think it's back to me again. So on the before we switch into today, so hopefully that recap helps everybody understand what we discussed on day 2. And as we move into day 3, looking at the piloting of Article 6, just the usual reminders that we've been sharing through the week. So firstly, yeah, you will be muted throughout just to facilitate that everyone can hear, and only the main speaker will be unmuted. Cameras, yeah, encouraged to be turned off. They're controllable from your side throughout, just to facilitate those with kind of limited bandwidth to make sure they can see the video feed. Maybe the most important one, there is a chat function, and you're encouraged to put your questions, type in your questions throughout the session, and then please just mention, you can type them to everybody and they'll be picked up from people from our side, and then just mention, if possible, who you're directing the question to, and then finally, yeah, the presentations will be made available after that are interested. So in saying that, there is only one PowerPoint today. And then we'll go into the panel. So I hope that's clear for everybody. I will now move on and hand over to my colleagues, Ruth and Julie. Those who've been with us for the week will know we just run a very quick poll to give everyone an indication of who's in the room. So Ruth and Julie, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Tim, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We'd like to run a short poll just to get a good overview of our audience. Now I'm going to launch the first question, and I hope you will see it on your screen. So the first question is, what kind of organization do you work for? Government, NGO, private sector, development partner, financial institution, and other, if there is. I see 27 people have voted so far. Large majority of the audience are from private sector, followed by NGO and financial institution. Yes. So yeah, the 37% of the participants are from private sector, and NGO 20%, and followed by development partners and financial institution. So by this, I will end the first question, and for the second question, Julie will take you through. Thank you for your participation.
Hi and good morning. I'm taking you through the second question. I hope you can all see it on your screens. We are asking, how many years experience do you have in the carbon markets and the carbon asset development sector? Thank you. I'm seeing a number of answers coming in. So far, the lead is the 10-year sector, the 10-year bracket, sorry. I have 83% voters have sent in their answers. . 78% then I can end and show you the results. In the lead is the 10+ years bracket, followed by the 2 to 5 years. And then we have less than 2 years, and the lowest number seems to be from the 5 to 10 year bracket. So once again, we have an interesting mix of participants. So hopefully during the engagement, we'll be able to see input from all these different people. Thank you so much for taking part, and I'll hand over back to the moderators.
And Ruth, for that. Very interesting. I think the reason we polled the first question was that there's clearly quite a significant role for the public and private sector partnerships under Article 6. So that was why we just wanted to get a feel, and there seems to be a decent balance in the room. And just one point, there seems to be from the 10+ people, at least 110 human years worth of experience for Article 6, which is quite a significant amount of time. Okay, so we'll move on now to the agenda for today, which I'll run through quickly. So we've already had the introductory session, and then we'll go as split slightly differently. So we're going to run the kind of familiar presentation and just shortly, and that will be, I mean, I think I'll introduce in a bit more detail in a second, but focusing around the piloting of Article 6. And we'll have a look at the kind of global context of how that's going, and then talk to 3 people representing government in 2 cases, and then a voluntary carbon standard. But I'll introduce that in a bit more detail. And maybe just to be fair to everyone and give them a heads up. We'll do a Zoom photo. If those of you that are familiar with this, we'll just ask everyone to turn their screens on at the end, their videos on, sorry, at the end of that initial panel and presentation discussion. We'll take a quick screenshot, a record of this interaction. So just so you can make sure your hair's all looking good for that. Okay. The next one is, so after the panel and presentation, a bit of a shift away from how we've been running the sessions on Monday and Wednesday. And the idea here is to break into the smaller groups and go through a peer-to-peer exchange or discussion sessions. So the idea, depending on numbers, is to split into 4 breakout rooms. So you'll be automatically assigned to a breakout room after that Zoom photo, and we'll introduce the task. And then there's 2 or 3 questions, sorry, 2 questions to run through in those groups, and then report back. But we'll share some more details about that after the hour. So yeah, I think, and then we'll just draw to a close. And as before, we'll just try to stick as much as possible to the 2 hours, which should be more than possible today. So we'll run through to around midday, and then Bianca and Sven from GIZ will do the quick closing. So I think we'll go into more detail on the first session in a second, but hopefully that gives an idea to people of what we're doing today. And then, yeah, I think I'll just continue straight in to the first panel stroke presentation. So there'll be input hopefully from 4 participants. Axel Michaloa, who will be representing the Climate Finance Innovators, will first of all give us a presentation on the kind of status globally around Article 6. Efforts have been underway. So it'll be interesting to see how that looks globally. And then we will likely jump into a panel with some questions directed towards our 3 panelists today. So Misha Klassen, who's representing the Click Foundation, and he can explain a bit more about that when we speak to him. Margaret Kim from the Gold Standard, to get a bit of a better understanding of how the voluntary carbon Article 6. Charlene Hemraj, who will be speaking on behalf of the South African carbon tax, and today on the potential role offsetting within the context of that. So Axel, I think I'll hand over to you. I will stop sharing my screen and then allow you to present your PowerPoint, but maybe I'll just ask you one very basic question right at the beginning, so make sure everyone's on the same page. What is an ITMO to get started? Yep, I can confirm we can see your screen, Axel, so we're good to go.
Great, good. So thanks a lot, and I'm happy to speak to you. And having worked in the East African region for quite some time now, I'm really happy to see that the private sector is strongly involved. The outcome of the poll is very clear on that. And my focus will be relating to, where do we stand with regard to Article 6 piloting, and where does the private sector come in? So before getting into the fray, I wanted to note that there is an written overview, a study on the Article 6 pilot landscape in the world. And there will be a new edition of that coming up in about a month's time. So I will not now paraphrase what is written in the study, because there you will find all the specific information regarding who does pilots, what are the specific features, how much money is involved, what are the target regions, and so on. What I would like to focus on today is that, in contrast to the situation that we had under the CDM, Africa is now being fully engaged in Article 6 piloting right from the outset. And that, of course, shows that Africa has really progressed a lot, because I remember in the first years of the CDM, everyone was talking about China and India, and Africa was seen as a backwater. This is no longer the case. And what I also would like to stress is that East Africa is at the forefront of piloting activities in Article 6, and that, of course, is very enheartening, because it shows that the various players in the Article 6 are really taking their region seriously. And if you would have asked an important CDM pilot actor in 2005 whether East Africa is relevant, he would probably have said no. And now you see that, for example, the CLIC Foundation, which is currently the probably biggest pilot in terms of funding and ITMO acquisition plans, is with us, shows this change in the regional approach. And that's, of course, really good. I would like to focus on what are the key changes for Article 6 pilots if you compare them to the Kyoto mechanisms, because you as private sector players have been involved in CDM, and I see many very experienced participants in this webinar. So under CDM, the situation was quite straightforward. This was a mechanism distinctly meant for the private sector. And in contrast to the initial expectations, where people thought, oh, there would be foreign direct investment in developing countries, and this would then lead to the generation of credits, it essentially came out as developing country entrepreneurs being really forward-looking and generating CDM credits as new type of export credit. So like you export coffee, now you export CERs. And of course, the governments usually played a relatively hands-off role because they did their letter of approval. But given that government didn't really have an issue because they didn't have emission targets, they usually granted these letters of approval relatively easily. Of course, we know that in the East African region, there were countries like Tanzania where it was still difficult to get a letter of approval. But the governments, at least, they let the CDM play. Article 6, of course, the role for governments is much larger than under the CDM, because now you have the need for the corresponding adjustment. meaning the government needs to do bookkeeping and needs to understand what are the underlying costs of the mitigation. And as has been discussed by Tim, of course, that means that the government needs to now plan carefully what is to be exported and what shall be kept in the country itself. We are unlikely to have very stringent emission targets in the short term. You've heard probably that China announced 2 days ago a net zero target for 2060. So if one of the largest economies in the world has this time frame, then it's clear that African LDCs probably would have a time frame until 2080 or something like that. So that means there's still quite a lot of time in which one can generate ITMOs, and one doesn't need to be too careful about the cost of the mitigation. But still, at least you need to report now as government about what you've done under Article 6. You need to negotiate contracts. You need to see how much of you actually give to the buyer, how much you keep for yourself. And this, of course, requires a lot of capacity and the possibility to interact between government, between private sector players who actually generate mitigation. Then there needs to be assessment, how much of the revenue stays with the government, how much goes to the private sector. So that means, one needs to carefully plan this. And then, of course, there is this whole movement towards upscaling, where people say, yes, these projects and even programs, they are not sufficient. One needs to go further. One needs to have policy instruments that drive mitigation in the whole sector, and therefore that you have an approach with benchmarking or maybe even best available technology. Of course, question how to interpret it, but still it's clear that this will be less geared towards specific private sector activities. I'm really happy that Misha from CLIC will be with us. I actually have worked a lot with CLIC in the context of their first 2 rounds of submissions for Article 6 piloting. And what I find really interesting, and of course Misha will explain more how CLIC works, but are certain of the criteria that are really geared towards the private sector. So one important criterion of CLIC is that there needs to be a plausible business model. And usually private sector is good in having business model and governments will be less. So it's clear that private sector will have an advantage of going for a CLIC submission. Similarly, there's this criterion of the suitability of counterparty. So CLIC wants to have really a counterparty that has a high reputation, that has shown that it can actually pull off things. So again, private sector is good in showing this compared to government companies. And then there are 3 other criteria that also, of course, are very relevant to private sector abilities, like this issue, of course, to show the convincing role of carbon, that this would not just be a business as usual action, but that the revenue from the ITMO sale actually is mobilizing the activity. Well, we've talked about additionality already earlier, but that of course brings it back. Then the self-sustainability. So of course the funding from the ITMO transaction will not last forever. How does the business manage to get the project running for the period after the revenues are over, after the credit is over? And then also, of course, the criterion with regard to limited and predictable risks. So does the activity have any unexpected repercussion? And to that, of course, again, the private sector is usually quite good in assessing risks. So to broaden this, I would say that the Article 6 piloting that we've seen to date of course, allows to generate practical experience, including the private sector. Yeah, Misha will talk about the next round that is coming up. So, of course, that will be attractive for private sector players. The first 2 rounds have seen successful submissions by private sector. And then, of course, the question is, how can the private sector build on what it has done to date? So many of you have developed POAs under the CDM. So of course, these POAs are good stepping stones for upscaling under Article 6. And if one sees at the top-down upscaling that we've seen, for example, from the World Bank, the Transformative Carbon Asset Facility, or the sectoral crediting framework, these have been a bit slow to materialize, and maybe the private sector can drive now how a real upscaling can work. Of course, Tim has already mentioned that this uncertainty about CDM transition may stifle private sector engagement. And I think the European Union plays a really dangerous role there in jeopardizing the possibility of the private sector to act quickly under Article 6. But I would say now East Africa is really well placed to engage in these piloting activities, in contrast to the CDM, where Africa was running behind. And I think this, of course, also today's strong participation by the private sector shows that you are willing to run and engage with the pilot buyers from the north, and that, of course, is a very good tendency. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Axel, for getting the core points across in relation to the piloting. I think just pause quickly. There is one question that's come in from the chat, and I think we have time to just answer it directly immediately after your presentation. And it's from GGGI in Uganda. I don't know whether you can see it, but I can also read it out so everyone can also follow it. Thanks for the presentation. Based on your slide with an indication of the role of the government, the person is expressing some concerns for the private sector. How willing will governments be, especially in the beginning, to allow ITMOs to be sold or transferred or exported, as long as they are not sure yet about reaching their commitments or not? Have any conversations and or explorations been done with any of the governments? So maybe you can give us an initial answer, Axel, and then I'd like to then come in and talk to Mr. Klassen from Click Foundation, who clearly has had quite a few conversations with governments already and might be able to add to that off the back of answering some other questions. So please go ahead, Axel.
Yeah, so of course, as I said, the government needs to have a clear view of what it wants to achieve domestically, what it wants to export. Usually countries in East Africa, of course, have 100% conditional NDC. So the big risk would relate to any unconditional components of the NDC, because these are not attractive for the buyer. So you need, of course, to ensure how you can manage those. With regards to the conditional part of the NDC, well, as the Swiss government, of course, has engaged in bilateral collaboration and discussions with various countries. Misha may detail that. Of course, we have also a very nice pilot of the Japanese, the so-called joint crediting mechanism, where they have set up joint committees between Japan and the host countries. Again, several countries in East Africa are parties to the JCM, and there they discuss in detail the sharing of the credits for each activity. Of course, the size of JCM projects to date has remained really small. The upscaling will, of course, be the big question. But in principle, one should really, from the government side, not fear that in the context of piloting, maybe a transaction of 100,000, 500,000, 1 million tons, that this would jeopardize the whole NDC of a country. Usually it would not. And I think in the past, there has been too much reluctance on the government side to test it out. Because I think once one has gone through the whole process, and of course one has also benefited from the lot of capacity building funding that is available, one will have really an advantage, and then see how for larger transactions one can actually safeguard the NDC. But again, as long as NDC is 100% conditional, the risk is rather low.
Great, thanks, Axel. And in that, I'll segue into Michelle. I hope you can hear us fine. And maybe my first question to you, yeah, please, I think Axel has given you a good platform, but please, yeah, take it to the Click Foundation, and then, yeah, we'd like to hear from you in relation to kind of the process, and delve a little bit deeper into that kind of experiences that you've had today, which are, yeah, probably some of the in-depth in the world as we go through this piloting phase. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for having me here, so to say. I'm given 10 minutes, but I could talk, of course, for hours and hours. We already did this in a separate webinar. I will share the link through the chat function right after my input. How to briefly introduce the Click Foundation. So actually this Swiss agency which is tasked to international emission reductions that are pledged by Switzerland in the context of its NDC. And to this end, we established in 2019 a procurement. We expect to need procuring 35 million ITMOs, or 35 million tons of CO2 emission reductions by 2030 in the total. And I really have to stress here again, we are not piloting. This is real. We are prepared to money into this exercise, and this is not a voluntary action. This is compliance. So we are really looking at how to get hold of emission reductions that qualify for ITMOs. And I could share the screen maybe to elaborate on that, but I'm a bit afraid to overstretch the 10 minutes then, so I really stick to my little script here. So what's really important to understand, that the Click Foundation operates under compliance regime, which is provided by the Swiss domestic national laws. So we are not operating under the Paris Agreement, which is a multilateral thingy, but we are really under Swiss domestic law, which also means that Switzerland, or the domestic law of Switzerland, provides the framework and also the rules and the requirements for ITMO for us to be useful. And this is also important to understand because Switzerland will, of course, 6.4 would work for us, but 6.4 is not available right now. So Switzerland decided very early on to put a lot of effort in 6.2, in bilateral engagement between states, between countries that are willing basically to do corresponding adjustments. So that's basically the first requirement or requisite to engage with Switzerland, the willingness to do corresponding adjustments and to undergo a bilateral agreement which is legally binding. And so Switzerland will sign on the 18th of October, we expect this date, the first bilateral agreement with Peru. And so in a few weeks' time, you will be able to read the text, which is still not disclosed yet, but you will see the bilateral agreement will deal with accounting, with obligations between countries on accounting, on avoiding double counting, corresponding adjustments, sustainable development and human rights will be very important. And it also provides for first transfer corresponding adjustments. So meaning everything that goes through the bilateral agreement out to Switzerland will come with corresponding adjustments, irrespective of its use. This is important to understand because the CLIC Foundation operates not in the context of this, or operates not within the this bilateral agreement, but in the context of the bilateral agreement. We will operate on private law between the project owner and us. So we will have this private contract as we know them from the past. But this also, the counterparty also can be a government agency, of course. But still, the bilateral agreement gives the frame for commercial interactions, commercial contracts between the project owner and CLIC. And it also means that the bilateral agreement does not provide for any kind of SOP or other provisions from the inset. So these kind of discussions will need to be held at the level of the concrete activity, because it also will, of course, involve the whole picture or impact the whole picture, also the pricing, and we will see, or we have to see if how far our willingness to pay will go there. This said, we have an existing procurement process. Probably most of the audience knows about it. It is open on a competitive basis to private entities, private sector. Governments always, anytime, can approach us through the web interface. You can just go, register, and you get access to submit mitigation activity idea notes to us. Yeah, the rest is, I don't dive into this. That's a separate webcast that we had, the process, how these activities are being managed or supported by us. We will not support the proposal phase. We will support the selected conceptual development, and we will support, of course, the implementation and the operation. So what's the status in Africa? We expect that soon after Peru, in November still, Ghana will follow suit with a bilateral agreement. So also in Ghana, we are very concretely discussing an activity that has been basically conceptualized by the UNDP, but is now carried top down from the EPA as a like umbrella, maybe even an umbrella activity or umbrella program. This national program to clean energy. Also in Senegal, we have very concrete activities, one in waste and one with biodigesters. Morocco has 2 leads going on, but there the negotiations are not as far as in Ghana. And we also have a strong interest from Kenya and Uganda. So we have like 10 activities, concrete leads going on. And there is a call opening early October, running until end of January for those private entities registered to submit their ideas or proposals. Now, very important in the African context, we heard a lot about this CDM transition and the questions the phone was ringing. CDM transition, and the question requires how what's the pipeline and so on. So perspective, the CDM is a very useful trajectory, basically. However, under these activities can be transitioned through a reinterpretation under the bilateral agreement. The bilateral agreement provides for an authorization step which is going to the Article 6.3, the voluntary participation. And this authorization, both from the transferring country, from the African country and Switzerland, they both individually authorize the activity. And in this step, the activity, the CDM, the activity which is registered on translated or transformed into the context which would or could mean that even nothing changes, because the baseline is really is clear, not form of the ambition of the host country, because it's maybe just not cost effective. Could also mean that activity is basically split into maybe the more remote areas that would work as ITMO activities authorized under the bilateral agreement, while the more core or urban areas would be available for action or climate finance. So there is a lot of thinking that can be creatively undertaken to meaningfully these registered activities, and there will be no issue in these activities. But there needs to be a translation step into the Paris Agreement, the level of the authorization. So please bring forward your CTM activities, maybe even, registered POAs, just add new CPAs, and we will be happily evaluating those. So that's not the issue. To conclude my the winning factors for Africa, I mean, Axel, I think he that is, I mean, what's critically missing is the engagement with Switzerland on a government level, which is more than just explorative. And what's really, really important is that these countries establish a decision body to deal with climate change issues. That there is a body that has a political mandate, not just financed by some ODA money or capacity building money to have these regular meetings, but there needs to be a political mandate, a political will to deal with climate change issues on a political. Countries or African countries need to have a plan to separate own ambition, which is open for ITMO crediting or climate finance. And this is important also to develop activities. There needs to be a steering committee or some political committee and deciding on issues like baseline and so on. So basically the EB and this body needs to be fledged with politics. This is a critical process that needs to be initiated early in order to have this decision power in place when it becomes relevant at the level of the development of, at the level of initiating and leading negotiations on a bilateral agreement. So with this, I'd like to stop here and on the spot, time is running. We have up until 2030. As you all know, you're from the private sector and experience the crediting period is shrinking. If you have a lead time developing the activity of 2 years and maybe 1 year is left for the countries to establish the capacity. So if we start now, we will be very quickly in 2025 with 5-year crediting left. And so my hope, and is that things are moving. So with this, I'd like to share or circulate the webcast link in the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Misha. That was yeah, really interesting. There's a couple of questions that come in, but I think we'll leave them right to the end, and we'll just go through the other couple of panelists. But yeah, two things I think right at the end there. The first one being or two rallying cries. Let's say, firstly to the governments to start. Thanks for sharing that. To work on those governance structures to be able to allow certainty around these discussions at the national level. And the second, again, on the timing with regards to implementation of these activities under that national regulatory certainty, which we hope is moving. With one eye on the time, I think we'll jump straight into the next panelist, and to Margaret Kim of Gold Standard, if you could also turn your video on, and then I'll just ask you a very open question based on what we've heard so far around Article 6. Where do you see the role of Gold Standard within this, and what have you been doing in regards to preparations for Article 6 and working with governments? Margaret?
Thank you, Tim, and good morning to everyone. So I think Gold Standard was present in the previous session to talk about what we do in the context of voluntary carbon market. And I think what's very important is what's our role in relation to and in the context of Article 6. So it's a great pleasure to be here. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, Gold Standard is an impact assessment standard body established by WWF and NGO supporters back in 2003. And since then, we have over 1,800 climate protection projects in 80 countries, which large part is coming from Africa, leading to more than 125 million tons of CO2 reduced. But often we are referred as a voluntary carbon standard, but if you go into the core of our methodologies, our projects and impact we're creating through our projects go beyond climate benefits. So sustainable development is really central to all of our projects and programs at Gold Standard to improve livelihoods, creating new jobs, improving health, empowering women, and etc. So our focus as a standard is to continue to raise the bar in ambition and integrity in various market and non-market based mechanisms where we operate in, to set best practice while focusing on ways to make that ambition achievable through providing tools and guidances to help project developers and governments to achieve their ambition. So in the context of Article 6, Gold Standard has been doing quite a few legs of work in the last few years. So from a policy level, we have been advocating strongly for sustainable development provisions under Paris, but more importantly, to demonstrate that best practice in piloting. And Misha rightly pointed out, it's not what CLIC is doing is no longer piloting. And it's great to see that sustainable development is fully mainstreamed into CLIC Foundation and Swiss government's ambition under Article 6. We're also developing, and I think this work is really complementing the work of CLIC Foundation and Swiss government. We're also developing an additionality framework for Article 6.2 with Government of Switzerland, so that this can help partner or host governments and partner countries under these bilateral agreements to mainstream these frameworks into their government processes. And Misha rightly pointed out the need for a mandated, politically mandated government body to oversee this. And I've worked with African countries, and many governments already have set up interministerial oversight sort of committees on NDCs and climate change objectives for the country. So I think it's really important that we integrate these elements into existing platforms and governance bodies that host governments have, so we're not creating duplicative efforts within the government. So having the specific additionality framework is very important to ensure that transactions lead to enhanced mitigation action beyond just pure offsetting, and that it leads to ambitious sustainable development outcomes along with the climate impact, and also reduce risk of overselling. So additionality framework will allow for countries to channel finance where it's most needed and to deliver the highest impact. And without additionality framework, we may be running into witnessing release of hot air by the countries. So we're really excited to be working with Swiss government and partners around this, and look forward to publishing it and working with regional organizations in other continents to pilot this and scale. So from policy level, we're working on those elements. From national government, host government level, we are working with, for example, government of Mongolia to design an integrated and optimized MRV framework that can allow the country to access various finance sources, including the various market mechanisms. I mean, as a market standard, we are also looking at this very much changing landscape. The line between voluntary versus compliance market is getting very fuzzy. So for host governments, clearly market-based mechanism or market mechanisms are a small fragment of an entire finance they need in order to drive their ambition and accelerate their progress in line with science. So it's important for governments to have that comprehensive view on how to identify their projects under certain sectors and under certain conditional NDCs that can access various market mechanisms, including some of the compliance markets that's emerging. And finally, on technology level, as a standard, we're further enhancing our registry and our systems to be able to integrate or speak to other systems that are at a national, regional, and international level, so that we're ready to cope with the changes under Paris regime, so that our projects that have gone through a rigorous process of gold standard can access various markets and be identified to prevent risk of double counting. In all of this work, what's really important, and I think this is really essential to everything we're discussing, is the need to recognize the transition and the need for transitional period for respective actors to build relevant capacity, have right technology and infrastructure and governance systems in place. For example, I think Sarah from Gold Standard in the previous session introduced the work we're doing with German government in developing a transitional framework for post-2020 voluntary carbon market. The reason why this work is really important is because the principles and tools under this framework can be used more broadly across markets, including Article 6 mechanisms. So for example, assessment criteria and processes for application of corresponding adjustment, criteria for transitioning existing projects. I mean, as a voluntary market player, we are already seeing the pressure and we need to make decisions on how to treat CDM projects. Platform for engagement and capacity building is also very key. Without a global rule book finalized, I think it's really important in the next 12 to 14 months that we really have a platform to discuss best practices, discuss challenges, and learn from each other on available tools and guidances. So finally, I think the successful implementation of Article 6 in Africa will really create new channels for climate finance and lead to technology transfer opportunities and really building in-house capacity within the governments, within the national bodies and private sector players in the context of Africa. So for Gold Standard, year 2020 has been, well, it's been tough for everybody, but it's been an exciting year for us in a sense that we have entered into many strategic partnerships to build these pilots and frameworks. So in 2021 and in the next few years, we're ready to partner with regional organizations, local organizations to pilot and scale the frameworks and tools that will be made available for private sector, government bodies, government agencies, subnational agencies to move forward under the Paris Agreement. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to complementing the work that's been going on with Axel's organization and Misha Click Foundation and Swiss government. Look forward to scaling that up in other regions going forward. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Margaret. Yeah, I think there's a theme emerging here through the presentations, and I think we're aware that the NDCs as the context within the Paris Agreement are key documents, but clearly that manifests itself in government structures and political will at the national level, which will then set the regulatory or policy framework under which the private sector can get engaged through Article 6 and ITMO transfers. So yeah, to both from bottom up to private sector to work with their governments to ensure that that framework is in place. Talking about Eastern Africa here and developers here, but also governments to organise themselves to allow this to happen is clearly a message coming through from all angles. And on that note, I'll turn to our colleague from South Africa, Charlene, if she's still with us. Might have dropped.
Yes.
Yes, Charlene,
Good
sorry.
morning.
I was busy searching for you there. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, very well. Okay. So yeah, from that perspective, so this interest in governments organising themselves and setting clear policy frameworks. Maybe let's say in 5 minutes, could you give us a very quick introduction to the South African carbon tax, which is a very interesting development on the continent and globally, of course, and then specifically the role of offsetting within that context. Slightly different, of course, away from Article 6 and international transfers, but also another way in which private sector can get involved domestically in the carbon game. Okay, over to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Tim. So as you would be aware, South Africa is the sort of biggest emitter in Africa. And in that context, we started a process about 10 years ago to look at the role for carbon pricing. And in particular, we looked at the role for carbon taxation as a way to price these emissions and address some of the externality costs, as well as create those incentives for businesses, individuals, general society, to make those behavior changes in order to shift and transition to a low carbon economy. So basically, our president signed the Carbon Tax Act into law in May last year. This gives effect to the carbon tax from the 1st of June 2019. The tax is quite comprehensive in its coverage. It covers a direct scope 1 emissions from energy combustion, fugitive emissions from mining, as well as industrial process emissions, which is essentially iron and steel, cement, the chemical sectors, etc. So it's very comprehensive in its coverage. The tax currently does not cover emissions from the agriculture, forestry, land use sectors and waste management sectors. And the main reason for this was because of the challenges around robust methodologies to actually estimate those emissions. The activities that are subject to the tax are essentially based on the IPCC 2006 guidelines that defines the various activities that emissions must be reported on. So the tax was introduced at a relatively low rate compared to the carbon prices proposed globally. So it's currently at 120 Rand per ton CO2 equivalent. So it covers carbon dioxide as well as the other greenhouse gases. That's basically around $7 US per ton. It essentially, look, we had engaged industry throughout a 10-year consultation process. And what started off as quite a stringent mechanism, obviously as part of the consultation process, had to be adjusted a bit. And a big part of that adjustment in the design of the tax was that we were required to provide what we call tax-free allowances for industries. And the reason for this was to basically address concerns around industrial competitiveness due to inaction elsewhere, as well as to provide flexibility to companies on how to reduce their emissions. So in this context, we have what we call tax-free allowances or deductions that can be claimed off the total greenhouse gas emissions of an entity. This ranges from 60% to around 90% for combustion-related emissions, and then to 95% for industrial process emissions. As part of this design of the tax, during the consultation process, our industries or sectors were quite forward-looking, and they basically requested that we consider the option of them using carbon offsets to reduce their tax liability. So we started a process in 2014 to develop an offsets paper to look at how carbon offsets could be implemented in a South African context in terms of a carbon tax. We know the EU has implemented offsets in terms of a trading scheme, but we had to develop a design around a carbon tax. So very quickly, this offset scheme is limited. So companies can reduce their tax liability by up to 5% for combustion emissions, 5% for industrial process emissions, and 10% for combustion emissions to reduce their tax liability. It's basically for projects developed under the 3 current international standards, which is the Clean Development Mechanism, the Gold Standard, Margaret, as well as the Verified Carbon Standard. And the reason for this was because we do not have the methodologies and the MRV infrastructure domestically to actually scientifically and accurately provide for this kind of mechanism. So the policy decision was taken to piggyback on the existing mechanisms. So currently the offsets is only available for projects developed in South Africa. And initially it was only supposed to focus on those activities that are not subject to the carbon tax. And the idea there was basically to give effect to additionality. So it was supposed to cover only the AFLU sector, the waste sectors. However, as part of the consultation process, there were some requests around including certain renewables that were not part of a domestic renewable IPP program, or there was a limitation put on the costs for these projects. So overall, in terms of the design of the offsets, we have put in place that limitation on the amount of offsets that can be used at 5 and 10%, as well as we have a maximum level of allowance that a company can qualify for at any time of 95%. And the reason for that is to make sure that at any point in time on the margin, at least 5% of emissions are taxed. We had to go this route of providing very generous allowances. And the reason for that was basically we wanted to introduce the tax, start off at a lower rate, start to create the incentives to encourage businesses, society at large, to start thinking about low carbon alternatives, energy efficiency. And as we go forward, to look at how we can ramp up the tax so it becomes more closely aligned with the social costs of carbon. And then maybe lastly, from my side, is that what we have learned through this process, especially around the offsets, it was one thing about saying that, these are the projects that are eligible, but we also had to look at the domestic infrastructure around administering the carbon offsets. So essentially, we have developed what we call a carbon offset administration system. So quite simply, it doesn't completely have a registry in it, but it basically facilitates the transfer of credits that have been developed under the 3 standards into the South African system to be converted into offsets that can be then used by companies to reduce their tax liability. And we've had to build in the necessary technical expertise in order for us to actually implement this instrument. So as we go forward, we're hoping that we will be reviewing this tax, we will be reviewing its impact in terms of reducing emissions, as well as we will be reviewing the carbon offset, the possibility of expanding the scope of the offsets beyond South Africa as we develop the capacity globally. And as part of that, probably also looking at the potential under Article 6 as that develops going forward. So thanks, Tim. That's my input.
Great. Thank you very much, Charlene. That was extremely informative from my side. And the reason I think for also bringing this domestic measure, let's say a national level, into this discussion is just to show and kind of repeat those messages around the importance of that national level context, which I think is fairly obvious, but it's just important for us to realize that this is no longer the Kyoto Protocol that we're living under, but a very different context. I'll just take the liberty of bringing in just one more impromptu speaker, Fenella from GGGI. Just for 2-3 minutes, Fenella, if you can unmute yourself, I think you should be able to. And just to tell us also about GGGI's experience or what you're engaged with regards to Article 6, and if any across East Africa, if possible.
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I must admit, I took a flick through the participants, and I have to say, lots of friends. So Maggie, lovely to see you after so long. And Dagmar and Bill and Gloria and Florian and Misha and Axel and Anna and Stefan, lots of friends in the market. So a little bit about GGGI and what we're doing. We are looking specifically at trying to help get potential seller countries into a position to be able to trade under Article 6. Say our concentration at the moment is not on the voluntary market, it's on the compliance market. So these would be Article 6 eligible ITMOs, but my feeling is that once we set the governance frameworks in place, as I've heard you all speak about, then that allows a country to approve for any type of project, voluntary or otherwise. So we have kindly been funded by both the Norwegian and the Swedish governments, and have another few potential programs in the pipeline as well. And that means that we can offer quite a bit of technical assistance to countries. And freshly announced for today is that we've just agreed as of yesterday that Sweden, we will actually be working in East Africa. So we will be rolling out a program in Ethiopia and also in Nepal and Cambodia. And that's more at what we would call the traditional project level. So kind of, let's say, a move on from the CDM, but obviously very bilaterally based, looking to help the governments work out one end of a MOPA from the other. What would they contractually need to agree to, and how can we help them set up the frameworks and put the things in place, whether it be the accountancy frameworks, the registries, the reporting, the MRV, whatever else is needed. Obviously that covers a very wide remit, so we're looking to very much work with partners who are also in this space, working with NDC partnerships. So that brings in Maggie's point of linking the NDCs all the way down to trading, and we're trying to sort of help fill in that gap. We can't do it for everybody, but for a few countries, fill in that gap to be able to then do project-based transactions. And actually, the idea is that the program ends with transactions. We're also working with Norway in perhaps what could definitely be seen as a more ambitious program, where we're actually looking at the thing that the CDM never managed to do, which is policy approaches, which, the door is open. as far as Article 6.2 is concerned. So we have the space for the Paris Agreement to enable these things, and Norway is very keen to say that, quite frankly, in order to get to the 2-degree target, we're going to have to do something substantially greater. So we've just finished a scoping phase in that, and we'll shortly be deciding on 3 or 4 countries where we will roll out the design phase for that. We're also dealing, Misha and Michael, we're dealing with the CLIC Foundation in a couple of countries, Morocco, and we're chatting in Senegal. And then there are, as I say, a couple of other ideas in the pipeline, but we very much see this as a continuation of not only putting green policies in place, but basically accessing finance. And I think one thing, I apologize, I joined late. I don't know if it's already been discussed, but I think I was chatting with someone yesterday and a really clear thing came out. You know, carbon finance is very different from climate finance. Climate finance is what you get from the GCF. It's basically some kind of ODA with some commercial money and blended together to give you a concessional loan or something. But effectively, it's a one-way street. It's ODA. Carbon finance is very different. It's a transaction. Now, what we all have to, and what host countries...
Fenella, may I just ask you to get it a bit now accelerated, because we have to do our breakout groups, and we need to save time for this. Sorry.
Sure, Axel, of course. So then my closing comment is, what we need to understand is that carbon finance is a diminishing pool. Climate finance is a diminishing pool. Carbon finance is a growing pool, because that's where the private sector comes in, whether it be through compliance mechanisms or voluntary mechanisms. So I think that's a good point to finish on, and to allow Axel to break away into his breakaway groups. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mela. And no, I think it's a really interesting point to the end. And thanks, sorry, I brought you in the last minute, so I'm responsible for that anyway. Okay, so I think leaves me to thank all of the panelists. I'll just hand over quickly to Bianca to see if there's any time or pressing questions from the chat. And then we'll move swiftly into the Zoom photo and then to the breakout groups after that. So over to you, Bianca.
Hi, Tim. I believe the questions have been asked already, at least to Misha. He's already responded in the chat. So in case anyone needs to see that, they can just go through it. There has been one question that's just come in asking Fenella to expound on the activities encompassed for Ethiopia, but if only we could have a response in less than a minute would be great, because we are running late on time. Yeah.
I don't know, I might get shouted at by Axel again. Okay, Ethiopia, we're looking at doing some work around some level of renewables, both small and larger scale, related to, some related to industrial parks, some grid connected. So it is helping the government with governance frameworks and understanding MOPAs, and hopefully ending in a transaction. None of our activities, to also take in the further question, none of our activities are related to forestry. They're all outside of forestry.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, Bianca, go on.
No, that's all right. Thank you, Tim. I think I'll just hand over for the next. We'll do a quick summary at the end when we're closing on all the 3 speakers, yes. But we can move to the next section. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thank you everyone. As usual, it's a little bit cramped on these sessions, and we're trying to keep it to the 2 hours. But thanks to all the panelists for making themselves available and for the inputs. Yes, I'm sure people can find out more information about the various initiatives you've discussed. So thank you again, and we'll quickly move on to the next session. Okay. Which I believe is immediately the Zoom photo shoot that we'll try. So I don't know if people are familiar with this, but hopefully also won't take up too much time. The idea is for everybody who's present to switch on their cameras if they are comfortable doing that. and then we'll aim to take a photo just as a record of who was part of this interaction. So if people could do that. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Cool, okay, and then if my colleagues can just confirm once that's been completed, it would be extremely useful. Everyone holds their smile.
Hi, Tim, it's done, but I'm seeing some people are still in, some people are still putting on their cameras, so maybe another 10 seconds.
Okay.
Yes.
Need to be careful with Axel. Yeah, 10 seconds.
So, yeah, that's done. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. That's highly appreciated. Bianca, yeah, go on.
Sorry, so there were two Gloria questions. Apologies. So one answered, yeah. So I think I'll just ask Misha I'll just ask one by Gloria, which was asking, the CLIC has mainly engaged with governments, and is there a process to bring the PS on board, recognizing that while the government will oversee the NDCs, it is really the private sector that implements the projects. Thank you. That's from Gloria and Gloria. Sorry. I don't know if that's.
Yeah.
I posted the answers.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. So both Glorias have been answered in the chat. Apologies. We don't want to read through everything, but yes, kindly just have a look at that. Tim, over to you. You can see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, that's done. So yeah, thanks everyone for staying with us as well. We're going to take a bit of a change of tact now and split into groups. So that the idea, I think there's about 45 people on the call. So we're going to split into groups, breakout rooms. You'll be automatically assigned to those. There's 4 rooms to be set up. There's 2 facilitators in each of those rooms. But the idea is, yeah, across the 3 days, it's been a bit more of a kind of webinar interaction with some Q&A. So just to facilitate a bit of an exchange, a peer-to-peer exchange and discussions around these topics in some smaller groups with some like-minded people. And the idea is then to, I think we'll, to colleague Ruth, we'll limit that to 25 minutes because I think that's gives us, we can come back in for the 5 minutes at the end for the reporting back. So kind of 25 minutes in those groups. And then, yeah, in those groups, just do a very quick introduction because I think there should be around 10 people per group, including the facilitators, and then discuss 2 questions, and you can focus on one of them or both of them. The first one was really in relation to, sorry, both of them are exploring this theme that has emerged throughout this morning, particularly around that kind of national level preparation and the different pressures or opportunities for national governments within this region. And firstly is, yeah, kind of what preparations or regulatory developments are needed from the host country governments for the asset owners or the project developers. Firstly, with a focus on the CDM transition, but secondly, around piloting, or don't need to focus necessarily on piloting, but implementing the future provisions of Article 6. So exploring those 2 questions. Feel free to focus on either one. So a brief introduction, some time to discuss those questions, and then the idea is in the classical way to report back the 2 main takeaways or the 1 or 2 main takeaways that were discussed in the group verbally, just the feedback verbally with 1 rapporteur for the full groups. So maybe just Ruth and Julie, or Ruth, sorry, if you can confirm that you are able to create those breakout groups now, because I think we can just move ahead.
Yeah, I'm almost done, just 10 seconds, please.
Okay, fine. And then maybe just one, yeah, people might need to drop out as well. That's absolutely fine, of course. Bianca, maybe just public housekeeping. Do you think we should do 20 minutes and then it stays a bit more on time?
Yes.
Okay, so if you could make it for 20 minutes, Ruth, and then we'll come back in.
Okay.
Wait a second. And yeah, sorry, I was going to say as well, just those of you not familiar with Zoom, there is a function in the top right-hand corner which allows you to go to a gallery view and you'll able to see everybody in the room rather than just the person speaking.
Tim, is Suri also in the call? I couldn't find him in the list, in our list. Just to double check.
I'm here.
You're here, okay. Okay, good to know. Suri.
Yeah, UNFCCC-RCC-UG.
And yeah, he's signed by his name, right? Yeah.
UNFCCC.
UNF, okay. I see, I got him now. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
20 minutes, you said.
Yeah. Work.
Okay, we are all set, and thank you for waiting me. And you will all be directed to your own respective rooms, and in each room we will have 2 facilitators. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Some initial ideas around this topic, but maybe firstly, in terms of the feedback before we move forward to the closing, I can yeah, maybe just pick on Rita from our group, just to say the 1 or 2 things that were discussed, though there was clearly a lot more than that. Rita.
Hi Tim, thanks. Yeah, the time, but we managed to sort of merge the questions and discussion. So mainly the aspects around what needed in private and private sector project developers to sort of ensure a smooth transition. There was an aspect of currently shifting and looking further on how governments can engage in carbon markets, but the issue comes around how to get capacity enhancement for corresponding adjustments, which is still and further better understanding for Article 6.2 and issues double counting. Similarly, there was a key point raised around the role of project developers. So for instance, third parties like DOEs, where there's a lot of discussion ongoing still around their role in piloting. So how they'll be working around countries with corresponding adjustments, also in terms of methodologies and accounting. I think, yeah, my 2 minutes are almost up, was the issue on de-risking were raised as a very key factor to sort of trigger investments at scale and also encourage the private sector to participate within the carbon market space. So I think I'll leave it at this, Tim, if, yeah, or if any other group member would like to pitch in. Otherwise, we could move to the next group. Thanks, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Rita. Sorry, a bit of a tricky task there because the conversation was just warming up as we jumped back in. So thank you. Maybe Axel to for the second group.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So on the first question, there was general feeling that the role of the domestic governments is limited at this stage, that first where there would have to be clarity from the negotiation process at EAACCC. And the private sector participants also stressed that it's very important to have this clarity to decide whether voluntary market would CDM or even a third approach only Article 6 pilots because in the market now. On the second question, yeah, had a political mandate for the governments to actually decide on Article 6 paramount. And the private sector players said they would really like to serve as catalyst in this context to prevent a catch-22 situation where government says, oh, we need to wait until we get some submissions from the private sector. And private sector says, yeah, but there's not sufficient certainty, therefore we act together. And it was also raised that in the context of government engagement, digitalization technologies could play a role. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Axel. And then Suri from Group D.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Tim. So we got off to a bit of a with the technology. And then just as the conversation was warming up, the time got a little bit short, but still there were a couple of things that were mentioned, not specifically addressed right to the Q1. What I heard was that actually the relationship with the domestic government is quite well established, but it's at the intergovernmental level that is really leading to the problems and uncertainty. And what also away from the discussions was that there's quite a lot of looking into actually moving the voluntary market, driven by the uncertainty at the intergovernmental level. So 2 points that I wanted to report back on. I hope that reflects the discussions, and yeah, anyone from Group D, feel free as well to jump back in and add anything that I missed. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Suri. Yeah, so I've given people difficult jobs here. But and in the final group, I don't know, I haven't heard from a representative.
Yeah, so I'll take over this point here. So in our group, we had discussed a few points, and I think the main message was that we need certainty. So on one hand, a clear institutional framework, also on a sectoral level, but related to that also, you know, a platform where one can have an exchange across different stakeholders on these issues. And that, I think, does relate to the fact that, of course, there is no certainty right now, so that people can really understand the issues well. And yeah, so I think this was seen as very important in order to mobilize practical investments. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. So I think, yeah, fairly similar. Yeah, again, apologies. Just gives us an opportunity to briefly explore some of the key things that we've heard across the past few days. And it seems to be the same themes coming through in there, probably fairly obvious themes, but themes that will likely run for the next 18 to 24 months. This certain and the potential role that the voluntary market will play in regard to that, and the whole transition that is being played out live at the EB at the moment. Structures and the how would you say, the robustness of those structures and the clarity that they can present, that then enables the private sector to interact with the actual project implementation at scale and hopefully at speed. I mean, these are general comments, but clearly it's raised in importance now as we hopefully move under Article 6. And then, yeah, both those governance structures in relation to two things I heard coming through: the actual transfer itself, so the kind of registry, the monitoring, etc., but also the clarity around the government and its willingness or its certainty around its ability to transfer those credits or not, or targets. So both of those elements. But I'll, yeah, in the interest of time, for the closing, for your brief proactive engagements in the breakout rooms. I hope you found them interesting, if a bit short. And then I'll hand back to you, Bianca.
Yes, indeed, the conversations were getting quite interesting. Huh? Thank you everyone for contributing and actually participating in that. Yeah, everyone's full, and so thank you for taking part in that. I think I'll just already noon. One thing that's come out quite clearly is that investment that's ready for activity. And you know, if you look at some of the initiatives like Click, they're like actually doing stuff right now. And you know, from the different speakers today, we've seen, even like from the gold standard, there's a lot of work going on with the governments, making sure that the frameworks are in place. There's a lot of work going on in bilateral agreements to enable the private sector to actually thrive in these different approaches. So there's a lot that's going on that we can actually learn from. We're to seeing what those bilateral agreements encompass, because there's information about and procedures. So case examples, especially here in Eastern Africa, there's already a lot of interest. Yeah, so we do know participants present here today are already engaging in these activities. So, and lastly, interesting to hear from South Africa on the initiatives they've been doing with the carbon tax. We had and allowing offsetting for some of the taxed 5 to 10%, but it was a very long consultative. So some of these initiatives take time, but the earlier we start, the better. And I do think the region definitely has been preparing quite a bit. And as Axel was saying, Africa can definitely, you know, we can be there when this starts and be ready and not get left behind. So in a nutshell, I do hope that you've taken away something from each single day, because they do build upon each other and there are a lot of interconnections. No one is operating in silos. Private sector is to enable the environment for private sector to thrive as well. And then we need to always ensure environmental integrity and transparency. So with that, I will bring it to a close. I don't know if Sven would like to say just a few words on behalf of GIZ and the 3 days we've been having this workshop. I don't know, is he still on the call? Sorry to put him on the spot. It's on, okay.
Yes, Bianca, sorry.
Great, sorry. Yeah, just to wrap up, but yes, hand it
Yeah.
over to you. I think we're
No,
done.
no,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, thanks a lot, Bianca, and also Tim for the really, I think, great moderation and great setup of the workshop. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, I want to also say, I know that there's a lot more people than you two behind that organizing team, the whole Climate Finance Innovators project, also our colleagues from the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center, of course, my team. Really, thanks a lot for facilitating, moderating the last 5 days. I think that was really great. And also I would like to say thanks to all the presenters, because I think we had really great inputs, and we did really see that there's such a vast experience in the private sector, in the carbon markets, both from the CDM and the voluntary market. We saw that there's a need to transition this experience, including methodologies, institutions, into the new framework of Article 6. And I also think that Article 6 really has new opportunities for the private sector to engage with governments in achieving their NDC targets by implementing different projects on climate action. And in the interest of time, really, I want to assure that we at GIZ, we will continue to support in the region, in the East African region. I think this collaboration now with the East African Alliance, also with our colleagues from RCC, has been really great, and we are looking forward to support that collaboration and activities as part of the Alliance. And with that, I guess, Bianca, I'd like to officially close the workshop. And yeah, I hope to see some of you in future, some point again in physical workshops. And yeah, have a great Friday, have a great weekend, and yeah, thanks a lot for your active participation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.
Thank you, bye.